Hello, hello. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for hosting us, Messari. This is the Rock the Vote panel, and I'm your moderator, Jack Platts. I work at Hypersphere Ventures, and I'm sitting in for Ashley Tyson. So first things first, give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we can dive in.
So I can go first. My name's Alex, and I'm a student at Columbia University, just uptown, and I'm the president of our student blockchain org, Blockchain at Columbia.
Hey guys, Kevin Nielsen, founder of Boardroom. We're building a governance and DAO aggregator platform and dashboard.
And then we have one panelist. Yeah.
Yep. I'm Monetsupply. I work with Tally, which is another governance interface, and then also with MakerDAO and a couple other protocols as a delegate.
Great. So one of the main things that we're talking about today is voting and decentralized governance in the context of DAOs. And for those that don't have like a good framework for thinking about DAOs, would like to ask the panelists to chime in on like how to think about DAOs. Would you kind of consider Bitcoin and Uniswap and some of these blockchains or smart contract applications that provide a service as DAOs as equivalently with, say, the Friends with Benefits or some media or community DAOs?
Yeah, I think DAOs are really just like tools and processes that can be enforced on chain, sometimes off chain, that essentially coordinate a set of distributed stakeholders, sometimes anonymous, sometimes most of the time remote, towards a common goal or mandate. And I think that's a super broad definition, but on purpose, because I think what you see is that we've essentially seen the diversity of use cases kind of completely explode from just the Bitcoin style, Uniswap, DeFi blue chips, et cetera, to every use case under the sun. And all of those are going to require different sets of tools. So I think giving it a super broad kind of like umbrella definition is actually helpful to give us the flexibility to like build tooling and infrastructure around these use cases. So I would really just say, it's infrastructure, it's a tool, a DAO is just a tool to coordinate distributed and stakeholders and individuals towards a common goal or mandate.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. We had our first meeting for a club last night, and a lot of people were asking, so what actually is a DAO? And kind of going off what Kevin was saying, basically the way I describe it is just kind of a general governance framework that can have a token, may not have a token, and can be extremely broadly applicable to any type of kind of crypto native or even non-crypto native organization. And really one of the kind of main key points of the advantages of a DAO is just having this reduction in friction by kind of playing off one of the main benefits of blockchains is just being a peer-to-peer efficient system.
And I like to think of DAOs kind of in comparison to companies. So they tend to be a lot more flat of organizations. They have a lot of like transparency and open access. So yeah, I think that's another differentiator that sets them apart.
So when you think about governance in the context of blockchain smart applications, these DAOs, what would you say are the main goals? Is it protocol upgrades and maintenance over the core software? Is it public goods, so creating new tooling, dashboards, that sort of thing? Or how do you, when you think about DAOs, treasury funding, these sort of things, what are the primary objectives that you want to see them coordinate around?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely dependent on use case, right? Like, what are those stakeholders there to do and to achieve? What's the goal of the actual DAO? Obviously, what we've seen happen is that like most decisions actually trend towards like some sort of like treasury allocation or distribution. I think 70+% of decisions have to do, with treasury allocations, just because that's a very objective initial use case for a lot of these, folks to coordinate around. But as the use cases diversify, I think we're going to see all types of decisions being made around, everything from coordination to work to contributions to treasury management, et cetera, to actually changes to the infrastructure of the code itself. So it completely depends on use case. Just compare a social token DAO like FWB or Forefront to a Uniswap or Compound, right? Like the actual decision making that has to be made, there's completely diverse and different. So I think it's kind of like good to leave it open right now. If we do draw comparisons to like corporations or LLCs and stuff, Governance usually isn't like, a big word. It's more of like a regulatory term that's kind of like used for disclosure and for some shareholder accountability. But for the most part, all governance responsibility is kind of like delegated to managers, right, and executives and board members. So here, we have a completely open design space where we can now kind of like map all these different types of decisions across all the, this insane variety of use cases. And I think, right, it's yet to see. I think you can literally make decisions around anything and everything.
I do think, though, kind of an important caveat is that while there are dozens of possibilities, and depending on what type of DAO, what type of governance decisions will be made by the common stakeholders, I do think having some focus, particular types of DAOs, on actually decisions that should be made, perhaps also shifting kind of more towards almost like a delegated model, where perhaps a lot of the participants could nominate people to then actually participate more actively, could be a better way to actually govern these different DAOs. So example could be like treasury management, perhaps. We've seen a lot kind of for Uniswap, a lot of these treasury allocation decisions become quite contentious. And I think kind of a way to mitigate that could perhaps to have a clear mandate that's almost voted on by people, and then allow kind of a smaller subsection of people to actually then go and make the more kind of like day-to-day treasury allocation decisions.
Yeah, I think it's really important to align behind a common vision as well. Like with companies, it's pretty simple. Usually they're just there to make money. DAOs, I think, are also often there to make money and increase in value, but that's just one element of them kind of becoming financially self-sustainable, which is like a prerequisite of them actually fulfilling their real vision. So I think that, yeah, each DAO has a unique vision, but it's important for them to like define that and figure out how to align behind that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Monetsupply. What would be, like, how do you coordinate around the primary goal? We've seen, and like, how do you define the primary goal? Is that up to the founders of the project at pre-Genesis? And then how do you serve that primary goal? We've seen the primary new governance model is around kind of coin voting, coin signaling, and obviously the coin holders' shared goal just objectively is to increase the value of the coins they all hold. So that's a pretty easy thing to define and look at. So how do you, when does that definition, when does that vision start out? Whose role is it to set the primary goal of the DAO? And if there is no kind of norm in the community around that, does it ultimately just fall to let's increase the value of the token, and is that okay?
I really do think it's at inception. I mean, it has to start off with the core group of initial individuals, and I think we're already seeing this with a lot of DAOs where you have a very small group of like highly engaged contributors, and then almost a supporting cast, right? Like in the outer bounds. I think everything is going to evolve that way. And to Alex's point about delegation of responsibility and setting up working groups, et cetera, you're always going to need a smaller number of managerial style stakeholders to drive the vision or drive some sort of like initiative or effort. How we develop like the systems to remain for those folks to remain accountable to the token holders is a completely different story that we'll dive into. But I think right now there has to be kind of like some set of managerial stakeholders that actually drive the vision forward, or it's like chaos to a certain extent. And I think the easiest way to do that is from inception, setting up a manifesto, really establishing what your core values are, why you're spinning up this DAO, why you're trying to coordinate these people in the first place, and communicating that as aggressively as possible to all future contributors too.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like kind of a typical startup where you have the initial founder, maybe founding team, really setting the initial vision to try to motivate people to come and work there initially when it's far more risky. But then as it evolves, of course, the vision does evolve, and as you have more stakeholders, they also perhaps have more input. But as Kevin was saying, I do agree where you kind of need this core group of contributors to all align with some mission, and I think that it does help and perhaps will lead to kind of higher value of the actual protocol and token in the future if it's something a bit broader and kind of more of an actual mission that people can align around beyond just increasing the value of the token. Because while, of course, everybody wants the protocol to be worth more and the tokens to be worth more, sometimes there is kind of a disconnect between those two. So I think focusing on the former of actually what can make the protocol have more users, have higher TVL, et cetera, should kind of be encapsulated in the mission.
I attended MCon last week, and there was like an interesting concept I heard first there called like mimetic filters, where if like you at inception of the DAO, you kind of create the memes or like the different like elements of vision that end up helping you attract the right people, and on the other hand, kind of like repel the people that are not going to help fulfill your vision. So yeah, I completely agree that it's really important to have a clear sense of why you're doing stuff from inception, and just making money is not that compelling. There's plenty of ways that you can make money in the crypto ecosystem. Why, as a contributor, would I sign up with your DAO if all you're doing is making money when I've already maybe got 5 other ways to do that?
Yeah, I guess the only argument you could make is, or one of the arguments you could make, I guess, is security, right? Like in the context, so like the initial meme of Uniswap is definitely like, let's be a decentralized exchange. So maybe the like $9 billion or whatever it is now in the Uniswap treasury should ultimately be used to perpetuate that meme, as well as build tooling that that actually enables it technologically. Whereas like something like a shared security protocol like Polkadot or maybe eventually Cosmos, their security relies on the value, I guess, of the token. That's their primary goal, is to provide security to other blockchains. So how like well, I guess let's maybe go in a different direction, unless you guys have thoughts on that.
I mean, just one real thing on that. It's interesting to think about like token value appreciation versus just like traditional shareholder value appreciation, and how we structure like these themes around it. It's a bit unrealistic to think that like everyone is going to be inspired by a meme that contributes to a DAO. I think there is always a component of like, essentially financial and speculative upside. Like we can't completely ignore that, right? As much as like all these social token DAOs are saying that like there's no value in the token, right? When you see it go up 10,000%, people don't ignore that, right? And a lot of like inbound contributors like literally come in through speculation. So I think we can't completely ignore kind of like the token value appreciation of it, especially, but of course it's important that we draw the contrast that that's not the only reason why we're here. Obviously in direct contrast with like traditional corporations and shareholder governance, et cetera. So I agree, like obviously the beauty and the novelty of all these systems is that, we can inspire memes and push folks to contribute for almost no apparent reason. But, I think we do have to consider like some component of token upside, and decisions have to be made in that framing too. And I know it sounds like super scary because like, the SEC is always lurking over like all these DAOs. But it's something that we're gonna have to eventually face.
Well, like I think there's a pretty good example of something without like an explicit meme at the beginning. It's this like adventure gold token that was launched to loot card holders, and they're like trying to retroactively figure out what the heck the thing's for. Like, does that work, or are they just pretty much effed?
So this is the A gold drop with like the loot token holders. I mean, I think, yeah, from that perspective, they launched with no real use case though, right? Like there's no utility to the token other than just being a potential future currency for loot holders or like future loot games, et cetera. So if you think about it right now, like all value created by a GLD is speculative, right? It's like coming out of thin air. So my question is like, at one point, it's like something we've always faced in crypto, right? Like at what point does something actually have like a real use case and utility? And the token doesn't only rely on like speculative appreciation for like future contributions. I think it's something that we have to consider in DAOs, because at the end of the day, like how you structure governance around that ideal as well is super important, and to prove that there is a distributed decision-making mechanism, that there is like diversity in the utility of the token, and that it's actually useful for other things, especially if you're claiming that the DAO token is a governance token, which for the last year, every DeFi blue chip did, right?
I think for securities stuff, might be like a slight sidetrack, but one distinction that you could make is that any value accrual that you're expecting, it should really be based on your own contributions, not the contributions of others. So I think that's another thing that I think is special about DAOs is like A gold, yeah, it's kind of intrinsically valueless, but a bunch of people have just kind of pitched in together to try and make it valuable. And yeah, there's hangers on and there's freeloaders, but the value is really kind of what you put into it.
Yeah, but I also definitely think that kind of prioritizing where the value might, like how the value might accrue to different tokens and members of the DAO, I think that should be specified perhaps at the start. So like DAOs where different governance token holders actually get proceeds, so get like a percentage of the treasury, or like as kind of akin to a dividend in traditional finance. That the dynamics in that kind of DAO, I think, can be way different than another DAO where it's like the token's just purely utility. Where I think like that idea of the token coming like increasing in value will probably be more correlated to your actual direct contributions.
That's a really good point. Actually, like a topic we don't bring up enough, I think, is stakeholder mapping in DAOs. Like, there's different types of contributors. There's different types of like engagement, and they should or could be rewarded differently. And I think that's also like where the idea of protocol politicians and stuff come in, and like how different delegates engage and who delegates to where, depending on strategy or like et cetera. I think mapping like who's actually a part of your DAO like should be step one, right? But I think for the most part, like in a lot of DAOs, we just consider everyone the same. Every contributor is the same. Every Discord member is the same, and they're rewarded the same in the same type of bounties and stuff. So stakeholder mapping, I think, is super underexplored in the space and could be really interesting to explore different contribution mechanisms around that.
Yeah, and I think one of you guys also brought up the idea of protocol funding for maintaining the protocol, for funding public goods. And a couple of things that we've seen since Bitcoin was like the only thing we're going to pay for explicitly is security. And then a bunch of people Bitcoiners made a bunch of money on Bitcoin and then started to donate to public goods. And that's like works to a certain extent. And then Ethereum kind of iterated on that with the idea of like a one-time funding pre-mine, like, hey, we're going to put these coins in this address because we're starting the project, and that's okay, or people feel like that's fine. But now we have these like billions and billions of dollars in Uniswap, synthetics, compound, et cetera. And so how do we? And then you have like DAOs from day one, like Yearn, who like put money in the DAO, and there's no pre-mine. So. How do you guys think about kind of the non-security funding for these protocols, and how that should be spent? Messari, our host, had this really nice article on blitzscaling where they're like, hey, these DAOs aren't spending enough money. They're not even spending like 1% of their treasury a year. If you were a company, like, you'd at least spend like 10%. You'd have 10 years. So how are you like? What's the trade-off between not doing anything and then having your competitors kind of? How do you think about that?
I think the main reason why that happened so far is because we first set up, these governance systems, especially for DeFi blue chips, so Uniswap, Compound, et cetera, the early ones. We set up these governance systems where they were pure coin votes with governance tokens, where a large number of stakeholders had to hit quorum. And before we could experiment with that governance system, the treasuries developed into billion-dollar treasuries that had to be spent through that governance mechanism that hadn't been really tested and had very low participation in some instances. Money can speak a bit more about that too with Uniswap, et cetera, Maker. But it was really interesting to see that like all treasury decisions, no matter how minuscule, had to flow through these like super bulky governance processes, with huge like startup costs, right? With huge like operational overhead. So I think what we started seeing on the DeFi side at the very least is like these sub-DAOs spin up, right? These grant DAOs spin up where they had broader mandates, like more flexibility in allocations, et cetera. And I think what we're going to see, especially with the longer tail of DAOs, is that governance, especially like governance that's directed towards the security side of the system or operational side of the system, may not necessarily overlap with treasury distributions. I think people are going to be delegated responsibility to actually allocate capital in ways they see fit. With a certain budget, a certain balance, et cetera, but given the leeway and flexibility to spend these funds as they see fit towards that broader mandate, towards that broader goal and community. If not, we're just going to like completely end up in a super inefficient system that is very hard to deploy, especially as these treasuries continue to grow.
Yeah, exactly. So, example, like for Uniswap Treasury, kind of this like the Uniswap grant program within the actual Uniswap Uniswap DAO. I think like this is kind of indicative of what Kevin was saying. We're seeing this development of these sub-DAOs. However, the actual deployment of capital and allocation to these kind of basically committees as an analog needs to be far more aggressive. We actually want to quote unquote blitzscale, as some like well-funded startups would do kind of in like the normal space outside of crypto.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a possibility of setting like KPIs just about getting money out the door. Like it's uncomfortable to say, but maybe we need to focus more on quantity first over quality. And then I think there's some other kind of low-hanging fruit as well, like hiring a governance facilitator, stuff like that. Somebody who's just like full-time working on governance and like communicating stuff. They can kind of be like the grease that will like keep your governance system running smoothly, and increase throughput and, you know, basically enable everything else that you want to do with your treasury. So yeah, I'm excited for, I think there are many DAOs who are like looking into hiring more like full-time committed contributors, and I think that'll be really fruitful.
Yeah, like a whip, someone to whip the votes. The one other thing, I guess still on the same topic was, you mentioned the bulkiness, Kevin. How do we reduce the friction for capital deployment for these DAOs? Our analyst at Hypersphere, Amir, came up with this question.
I really do think that it's just the delegation of the responsibility, right, across like a number of different working groups, for example. I think we've seen that work really, really well with some of the newer, I mean, not newer, some DAOs like Index or Forefront, et cetera, that have like very specific guilds set up that just focus on one very specific mandate, right? Like running ops or like pushing marketing or distributing treasuries. I think like that delegation, you're going to end up with like this fractal system, right, of like a mega DAO with a ton of sub DAOs that are like liable or accountable to that broader DAO for their like broad funding, right? And I think that's like the way we scale. That's the way I think that we're seeing it now with the DeFi blue chips, where it's so apparent that we need to distribute these funds quickly. But I think we'll see it like in the inception of DAOs. These working groups are already set up as almost like pods.
Yeah, and then having, as Monetsupply said, having kind of very clear, kind of maybe potentially like top-down KPIs, or even kind of bottom-up, just everybody in the community can vote, as well as having easy tools like Fish Vote, for example, to be able to pool a bunch of small votes to kind of form like a temporary delegate for like any type of kind of broader like DAO vote. I think is essential to actually increasing the rate of capital deployment.
And I think there's one layer where we need to be delegating a lot more of like executive kind of responsibilities, like, okay, who's going to handle marketing, who's going to handle XYZ responsibility of the DAO. But we can also get a lot of benefit out of just like vote delegation. So like someone like a protocol like Gitcoin, to claim the Gitcoin airdrop, you had to either delegate to yourself or to someone else. So they had pretty much like 100% of their tokens engaged in governance from day one. I think there's some pitfalls to that, but on the flip side, I think that's it'll maybe make the actual like token voting part of governance a lot more agile and working better.
Yeah, and I also wonder if there's an opportunity to actually delegate responsibility to like strategies and automate some of the governance processes. So I'm curious, like we've developed these systems where we're always delegating, especially with Gitcoin and some of the other newer protocols too. We're delegating to a specific stakeholder, a specific person. I'm curious, like in the corporate governance world, all governance is almost like semi-automated, right? Like brokers essentially, like no one actually votes their shares, right? I think 5% participation in shareholder actual voting. Everything's done by proxy. You hold your shares like through a broker. The broker outsources like the actual delegation mechanism to a proxy advisory firm, ISS and Glass Lewis, and like 90% of the recommendations are taken by the broker. So the entire process is like super automated. I'm curious if we'll get to like a similar stage with delegation of responsibility in DAOs, where you're not only delegating to like a specific person or stakeholder, but you can maybe delegate to like a proxy contract that has a specific strategy and auto votes in certain directions, and you always have a veto. I don't know, there's just like so much design space here that we can explore, and it's super fascinating. But I think as we develop better tools around all of this, I think we're gonna have a lot more flexibility and a lot more effective like governance mechanisms too.
I know ISS and Glass Lewis they've been taking some heat recently, so I don't know if we exactly want to. I think we can do it a lot better than they do.
No,
Basically, we have
yeah.
the tools to do it even better.
I don't think we'd ever want to replicate their models. If anything, they like control the entire corporate Fortune 500, right? Which is like super
Yep.
scary, and they're extremely opaque. But now maybe we can do it like as a smart contract, like a completely open and transparent setting. I don't know. Now we can have like stakeholder, token holder vetoes, right? That you can claw back your vote from your delegate. I don't know. There's so much cool stuff that we can build around these things.
Or around like the delegation protocols, perhaps it'll help with, whenever you think of coin voting, it's ultimately like some sort of plutocracy, right? It's maybe better than some of the ones we have now because all the rules are on chain and everyone, and at least it's transparent. But I guess delegation protocols could reduce some of the inequalities in the system. And Uniswap Treasury funded this Sybil delegation protocol. Is that things you guys are implementing into Tally and Boardroom?
Yeah, for sure. I think identity, sources of reputation, sources of work, contribution. Those are all things that we'll eventually want to aggregate. Boardroom right now we pull in info from Sybil, like verifications, for example. All those things are going to be all those data sources are going to be really important to build kind of like this social graph or social picture of like even a wallet address, right, or a pseudonymous identity. It's going to be super important. Again, back to that idea of like stakeholder mapping, right, to be able to understand who like exists in your DAO, who's doing what, and who should be rewarded for different things. And I think like that granularity is going to bring a lot of like new design like space as well. So yeah, super important. And I think it could be, it should be up to kind of like the protocols themselves, I think, to spin up these tools. Not that, Boredom wouldn't want to like contribute wherever we can.